All right. Let's get fired up here.
Maximum freedom. Read.
Stay on target.
Maximum freedom.
Stay on target.
Maximum freedom. Read Rothbard.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Actual Anarchy podcast, the podcast where we take actual events portrayed in movies of actual anarchy. And by actual anarchy, we mean not the fake-ass anarchy like you're seeing at the Trump inauguration, smashing up a Starbucks window, lighting people on fire, punching Nazis, any of that stuff. My name is Daniel, and with me, as always, is Robert Johnson. How are you doing, Robert?
What's up, Genderhammer? I'm doing great. I'm excited for this episode. This is a spicy meatball of a movie we're going to be talking about today. All kinds of shiz going on up in it.
Yeah, we might actually need to break this one out into 2 episodes because we're talking about the movie Captain Fantastic, starring Viggo Mortensen, that came out about a year ago. And it has so many points to expand upon. But before we get into that, I want to tell you a little bit more about what we do. We run AnarchoCapitalist.com, which right now directs to readrothbard.com, which is a site that we run with Murray Rothbard lectures, books, articles, and a podcast that is what we do now, but it used to be called the Read Rothbard podcast. Going forward, that one will have audiobooks by Murray Rothbard. We also have another podcast called Enemy of the State, and that is lectures actually delivered by Murray Rothbard. And then we have this podcast, the Actual Anarchy podcast. And like I was saying, if you go to actualanarchy.com, you will end up at readrothbard.com. Eventually, we will populate something at actualanarchy.com, so look out for that. It just takes us a long time to get anything done. I've got 2 kids. Robert lives out in the mountains or the hills. He's a hill person now. And so it just takes us a while to get things accomplished around here, but I promise we will get it done.
And like all our promises, we totally fulfill them. Totally.
Oh, we've kept 1 or 2. I don't know. Here and there.
We're probably batting around 200. I don't know. It's not the worst.
Yeah, we're
probably not big league numbers, but we might be able to make it in the minors.
Well, you've heard of the Mendoza line, right?
Nope.
The Mendoza line is a batting average of about 200. And I forget exactly why it's significant, but apparently if you're batting below the Mendoza line, you're no good. The Mendoza line is like the minimum viable player. And ironically enough, he was a Seattle Mariner for a time.
That sounds about right.
Long-suffering franchise that Robert and I grew up watching. I mean, we had some great players over the years. I mean, in the late 90s, early 2000s, they were fucking stacked.
Yeah, you got guys like Edgar, KGJ, Tino, A-Rod, all those guys. Yeah.
You had Randy Johnson, Buhner.
Yeah.
Martinez, Tino Martinez, right? He was also...
And Edgar Martinez, yeah, both of them, before they all went to the Yankees.
Yeah, I mean, they were, on paper, an amazing team. They just never got anywhere. And it was only after, I think, Junior and A-Rod and Randy Johnson left that they had that 116-win season and were just balls to the wall, amazingly good. And then they crapped out in the playoffs after... Did they beat, the White Sox in round 1 and then lost?
I thought round 1 was just against the Yankees and we just got stomped.
I don't
remember recall.
Exactly.
On 116, yeah. I think that was the very first round. Played the Yankees, then we got, I don't know if we got swept, but we got hastily rejected. Was that Ichiro's, one of Ichiro's first years? I forget.
Yeah, I think he won MVP, Rookie of the Year, and was on the 116-win team. He won the batting title, and I think had the most number of steals, and had all these amazing, center field plays where he'd throw the guy out at home. And this guy weighed like 150 pounds, and he could rocket the ball all the way from deep center field with accuracy, laser beam style, and get guys out of the plate. Pretty amazing guy.
Yeah, he threw that ball on a rope. It was just like there was no arc to it, just fired out of a gun. I don't know how he had such an arm.
So not to confuse you guys who may be new listeners, we are not a sports podcast. We just go off on tangents. That's our thing. We are just two guys having a conversation, talking about anarchy, actual anarchy, varieties of it. We talk about movies. We analyze the plot, the characters, their actions for the morality of it in relation to the non-aggression principle. If there's an instance where there's a lesson from Austrian Economics, we'll talk about it. And that's generally what we do. You want to add anything to that, Robert?
Nope. You summed it up nicely.
Yeah, so that was one of the feedback things that we got from people listening to our previous iteration of the show, was that they felt like they were just dropped into a conversation between us guys, and they had no idea what our show was about. Because we always have to remember that somebody may not start back at episode 1. I mean, we were on episode 40 of the Read Rothbard podcast, and someone may pick it up at any point. So we have to, in every episode, at least mention what it is we do and how we do it in a brief, little deal, and then move into the meat of the episode, which we are going to get to now. By the way, click on any Amazon link on readrothbard.com, and we will get a little bit of a commission. Show your support. We've also got a Patreon page, a tip jar page, Liberty Classroom links, readitfor.me links, any of those things. I just had to throw it in there because any little, comment, promotion, like, share, smoke signal, skywriting helps us keep going. So on with the show, Robert.
Let's do this. So Captain Fantastico, starring Viggo Mortensen, good old Aragorn himself. 2016, fairly well reviewed. It's like an 82% on Rotten Tomatoes, 7.9 IMDb, 94% Google users like it. Overall, I'd say it's a fairly well done movie, but are the devil's in the details. And there's all kinds of little issues to talk about here. So the movie is essentially a kind of, how do you characterize it? Like a man and a wife, two kind of, even though it's the wrong age, like the wife she dies when she's like 41. So she was born in 1974, but yet they're very much like a hippie parents. And they decided that they're going to raise their children in the wilds of the Cascade Mountains in Washington State. So you've got this, and when the movie starts, the wife is not to be found, but we see the family kind of living in the nature, and we learn very quickly that the mother is sick, and that then she quickly dies. She has committed suicide. And the family they feel like they want to go to her funeral. And the movie is essentially a fish out of water, like road trip movie. You got these kids that have been homeschooled their whole life, and they're being exposed to like modern society, modern culture for the first time. And so then there's all those kind of interactions that the movie kind of plays off of. And then there's a conflict with the wife's parents, who wanted to have like this Christian burial, when in fact, according to her will, she was a Buddhist and wanted to be cremated. So the family goes down to basically rescue the body so that they can go burn it and have their own kind of like ceremony according to her wishes. And that's essentially the plot of the movie. But man, is there all kinds of stuff to get into. Okay, so do you have anything to add before we move on to each individual scene, Daniel?
Nothing in particular, but I did notice that there was a lot of contradiction in the movie.
Oh, yeah.
Sort of the theme that that I noticed within it, and I'm sure that will be many of the talking points that we discuss throughout our show.
Right, and I have, generally in a movie, you want your characters to have an arc, and you want them to have some sort of a conflict, maybe some sort of either external conflict or an internal conflict. Generally an internal conflict, because then that would lead to a change in the character. But the question is, in this movie, is the change believable? And we can get into that, but we will get into that later. So, first scene, you're in the wild wilderness of the Washington Cascades, and socialist family Robinson is out on a hunt, camoed up like Arnold Schwarzenegger in Predator. And the oldest son jumps out of the bushes and gives a straight razor to the throat of a deer who was just passing by minding his own business. Okay? And the whole family jumps out, and then they celebrate, a successful hunt.
They're like Predator style. They're all like covered in mud.
Yeah, they're covered in mud. They got camoed up. They're covered in like animal skins and whatever.
Right. So it's
and
like
they're hunting like with just knives.
Schwarzenegger fighting the alien and Predator.
Basically hunting the Predator, yeah. And then Viggo Mortensen, whose character name I think is like Ben. Yeah, Ben. He goes up to the deer and he cuts out the liver, or a chunk of the liver, and he hands it to his son, his oldest son, who made the kill. And he's like, the boy is dead. In his place is a man. And the boy starts eating the liver. And then they hike the deer back to camp, and then they start, preparing it for food. Now, do you have any issues whatsoever at this point? You got a family hunting for their dinner. Any kind of issues arise from just what you've seen so far?
The only issue I had was I'm glad that I wasn't watching the movie with my kids, because I think it would freak them out that Bambi was getting the throat slit. But so far everything's kosher, man. I mean, they're just living a relatively primitive, back to the land lifestyle, which is,
right.
If somebody chooses to do that, so be it. Go for it.
Right. He's making the choice. He made the choice with his wife to live out there, and they're raising the children as best they know how, and part of that involves hunting for food. And you could argue that this is a much more humane way of getting food than, factory farming or what have you for the animals we have. But anyway, so they have eaten the food, and the girls immediately can't find like the paring knife or the boning knife, I think they call it. And so then Viggo Mortensen has to go get it. And it's the youngest girl has it, and she has this little hut. And so Viggo goes up there, and she has made this altar of dead animal, like bones and skin and feathers. And on the wall of her little teepee, she's got pictures of Pol Pot and skulls. And for this was very realistic for me, because I know a little girl that is like obsessed with death and morbidity. So that it's weird that the father wouldn't say more about it. That, hey, Pol Pot, I mean, what is this? All this death and murder and stuff. But to have a little morbid kid is a very real thing. And throughout the movie, she makes comments about the human body and how you would die and what a kill mark is and that sort of thing. What did you think about that little girl character? Hit a little close to home, Daniel?
Do we know the same morbid child?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So my daughter does like dead rats and dead chickens and things like that. We speak to her almost as an adult, and I think that was one of the things that the Viggo Mortensen character does in this movie. And in fact, I think when you were mentioning this movie to me, suggesting it, you were saying, in watching this movie, I thought of you 10 or 15 years in the future because of how you interact with your kids and how you're very blunt with people. But
right.
Also, I imagine, living out of the city and trying to acquire skills and all of these things and doing the whole homeschool thing, which will become a very important point later on in this show. But yeah,
like a more survivalist version of you and your family, that sort of thing. Just with you and like teaching your kids the best you know how and that sort of thing. But go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. So it did bother me in the respect that she had this shrine with skulls and dead animal parts, but also pictures of Pol Pot and actual human skulls in this little shrine she built. And I was a little confused about whether she was doing it as a fan of Pol Pot and what he had done, because there's a contradiction here, because even by this point in the film, you're kind of aware that the kids are smart and well-read. Like they're around the campfire reading, books well beyond their age level in commonplace.
Right.
And they're obviously doing an effort to acquire skills and knowledge, and not just on a surface level, but at a deeper level, like analyzing it, synthesizing it, like tell me in your own words what this means and what are the implications of it. And that's what the Vigo character pushes in his kids. Don't just recite what it is. Tell me why it's good, why it's bad. What do you think about it in your own words? And so I find that a huge contradiction with the whole idea of Pol Pot, who in Cambodia killed millions and millions of people who were a threat to his imposition of communism if they were intellectual, if they could read, if they wore glasses. And so for some child to be able to read and have intellect and knowledge, to then exhibit an appreciation for that man, when if she lived in that country at that time, she would have been murdered as a result of her actions and her abilities and skills, it just really freaked me out. It was weird.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here. On the one hand, Viggo Mortensen's character, we don't really exactly learn what his beliefs are to a certain extent. Just by the whole movie, we get a fairly good picture of what he believes, but he never declares that he's like a socialist or a communist or whatever. We learned that his children, at least one of them is, for sure, a communist. And so you assume that they're picking up a lot of his beliefs, because at one point, one of the little kids kind of explains what fascism is and basically parrots what the father had said earlier. Well, we don't hear what the father says, but one of the characters says that you're just repeating what Dad says. So is this little girl, it seemed to be like this kind of synthesis of kind of the socialist ideal with her obsession with morbidity and death, and not so much, like having skulls on your wall when you're like a teenager and you're rebelling and you're just depressed all the time or what have you. I mean, this kid's way too young to be doing that at that point. But, the idea that she'd be exhibiting features that would have gotten her killed in Pol Pot's Cambodia, at the same time she's got the pictures on her wall, so you don't generally put things on your wall of things you dislike. But at the same time, the father doesn't really make a judgment about it. He just says, Pol Pot, or no, he goes, what? And he looks at the pictures, and then the kid says, Pol Pot. And he's like, okay, or whatever, and then he leaves. He doesn't really make a judgment on it. I think that would have been a good teaching moment for a father to talk about Pol Pot with the child, but he passed on that at that point. I don't know whether he condones it or not, but by not addressing it, he kind of condones it.
Oh, positive obligations, Robert. Positive obligation alert.
Well, when you have children, you are accepting a contract.
An implicit contract?
Yeah, it's an implicit contract. You create that person, you bring them into the world, you are accepting responsibility. In my view, I know Rothbard disagrees with me, but you're bringing someone into the world that has no choice in the matter. So you have an implicit contract and you want to anyway. You don't even, this isn't even super necessary, because parents want, just inherently, they want to see their DNA be replicated and succeed. It's a validation of their choices and themselves and their DNA. So he has an incentive already, beyond any philosophical or morality concerns, to want to educate the child as best he knows, to prepare the child as best for the world as he knows, to warn the child of the dangers of horrific ideologies like those espoused by Pol Pot.
Right, but as we proceed within the film, which I'm sure we're going to do, we see more and more examples of the father actually being a communist and being supportive of these ideas, which again is very contradictory to as well-read and well intellectually driven that they are.
Well, the socialism has a fair intellectual cover in the world's universities right now. I would argue that is the prevailing wisdom.
I will grant you that, yes. But it's under the guise of things that sound good or seem nice, but they fail to see the consequences of the actions, and they look for the seen results of whatever the name of the bill is or whatever the positively affected party is. They disregard the costs or the negative consequences or the unseen consequences or the potential that could have been. That's totally pushed to the wayside.
Agreed. They tend to believe, or at least they seem to believe, that there is this magic money pile and that it should just be distributed in a better way to the things that I think need money as opposed to what other people think need money. I don't think they take into account the whole idea that the fact that there is a money pile, that there shouldn't be a money pile in the first place.
Or that
you have no moral right to spend other people's money.
Right, but if they are viewing something as a money pile, they look at it as a fixed sum that needs to be distributed differently versus a way to make the pie bigger. Like, it doesn't matter what the arbitrary line of poverty is. If more people are able to have water and have food and have shelter, it shouldn't matter what the income disparity is between people. If all boats are rising, and even if they're rising at different rates, the fact that all boats have risen should be the important point. Not that, well, they grew faster than me, therefore they're bad.
No, it should be absolutely quality of life. Absolutely should be the metric, not some arbitrary line of, well, he makes $22,000 a year and he makes $47,000 a year. It doesn't, none of that makes any sense. It's a constantly shifting goalpost.
Right, and more percentage of the population have been risen above actual poverty, like improving living standards, since the 1800s than throughout all of human history. Like, it's almost an exponential graph, the quality of life and the percentage of people who have achieved it. Thus, the reduction in poverty. Like, the whole point I'm trying to make is that more people are able to live now at a higher level of living, higher standard of living, than in all history.
Correct. And the fact that there's like some idiotic war on poverty, when there will always be poverty as long as you always define certain percentage of people as being poor, means that you can never win this war of yours. Which is just a justification for more cash to grab.
If you break everything into quintiles, like 20% segments, well, there's always going to be a lower 20%, a middle lower, and a dead middle, and a middle upper, and an upper. There's always going to be 5 segments. So even if everyone's, even if the low segment made $1 million a year, and then top segment made $1 billion a year, well, guess what? You're still in the lowest 20% if you make $5 million a year.
Yeah, you could be living in, 12 mansions, but if your neighbor has 15 mansions, you're upset about it. All right, so let's get back to the movie. We've finished about 2 scenes. So let's keep it going here.
Moving on.
The next scene is a hand-to-hand combat training scene, where the father has the kids out training, and they're practicing with little sticks and they're trying to kill each other. Literally, that's what he says. He knows you're not actually trying to actually stab the person to death, but the kids do actually stab each other a little bit. And he's like, well, you should have dodged better or whatever. Do you have any issues with this scene whatsoever?
No issues whatsoever. I think that you need to practice as if it's game time. Otherwise, you're going to run the plays at a slower speed. If you're actually in the situation, you might not go through with the full power that you would otherwise. So I'm totally fine with this.
Okay. Next scene, is the scene you were talking about earlier. They're reading by campfire light, and everybody's doing their studies. And it's shown that the kids are super advanced. Like the one girl is reading up on like Planck's law and high level like mathematics and that sort of thing, and physics. And then they start into this family jam session. So you see that everybody's super intelligent, and you're seeing that everybody is multi-talented. Everybody's playing like instruments. Then the next day, they're doing some running, and then Dad's going to go into town. And one thing I liked was that I forget what the boy said, but the oldest boy, but the girl admonishes the oldest boy not to speak to her as if she's an inferior, which is kind of cool. And then they repeat some of the things that the father had said, like Americans are undereducated and over-medicated.
Probably true.
Which I don't have an issue with. Do you, Daniel?
No, I think that's probably true. I think that anytime you have a monopoly on a school system, that the quality of that education is maybe very low, and anytime you have a pharmaceutical industry that is highly regulated, even a medical industry, where the answer is you need this drug, you need that drug, then yeah, over-medicated and undereducated for sure.
And not to mention the socialized medical system, where your incentive isn't necessarily to take better care of yourself. You don't necessarily making the best possible choices for yourself if you don't actually have to pay for it yourself. So
right,
if you're counting on
the incentive is to bitch and moan about how you don't have coverage,
right,
and try to get coverage even for a pre-existing condition that is a result of some, not always, but sometimes a preventable thing. Being out of shape, overeating, not exercising, those types of issues.
Right. When you're not actually having to pay the costs, you're far more likely to let your body go to shit. Not for everybody, but you're more likely to if you don't actually have to pay the costs and the consequences of those choices. So they pile the dad and the older son. They pile into the bus, which they call Steve, and they drive Steve to like a local store, which is kind of like an all-in-one general store out in the middle of nowhere. So there's like a bar, like a restaurant. You can get your mail there. You can buy gas, and you can make phone calls and buy some other things probably. They're walking into the store, and they run into some girls. And the oldest boy, Bo, doesn't know what to do. He kind of acts weird. And the dad is like, yeah, we got time. Go talk to those girls. And he's like, why? So I can ask her what she thinks about the working people creating an armed revolution against the exploiting classes and their state structures? So right off the bat, this guy's total commie. I mean, whenever you hear working people, armed revolution, exploiting classes, you think communism. So he's like, I don't know how to interact with other human beings. All I know is this, Marxist ideology and philosophy and things written down in books. I wouldn't know how to really talk to these girls, or I don't really have an interest in talking to them unless it's about, really high-level stuff, even though I would argue that Marxism isn't exactly the most high-level stuff. But
what is in our universities?
Right, in our universities. So he's kind of saying that, he would be speaking a different language to these girls, so it's not really – it's kind of pointless.
Right, but he was certainly socially awkward in that situation as well. Like, he froze, and the girl tried to talk to him, and he was just like, Right, and later on, he kind of blames that on his dad, saying that he's like this freak that doesn't know anything about anything.
because he's been sheltered his whole life in this
unless it's out of
world.
a book, which was
Right,
the Robin Williams argument to Matt Damon in Good Will Hunting.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
What does the Sistine Chapel smell like, or something?
Right. So anyway, back to the movie. Ben, the father, he replies and says, Marxists can be just as genocidal as capitalists. And then his son replies, I'm a Maoist. And he gets into the differences between, like, Trotskyites and Leninists and Stalinists and all that kind of crap.
All right, so let's stick on this point for a minute, because I want to try to talk through these, because there apparently is a distinction between them. Because if I remember, he says, Vigo says to him, "Are you a Trotskyite now, or something like that?" And he goes, "Only a Marxist would say I'm a Trotskyite. I'm a Trotskyist, or I was a Trotskyist, and now I'm a Maoist." Like, he
that sounds about right.
About the "ite" or the "ist," and one of them was defamatory towards whatever he used to be, and one of them was appropriate for whatever he used to be, but it didn't matter because now he's a Maoist.
Right, I think, yeah. So he was saying that Trotskyite was a detracting term used by opponents.
Right. So Trotskyist was the legitimate term, but he's no longer a Trotskyist anyway, so now he's a Maoist.
And it's so weird to have the entire movie be about these super intelligent kids and not be aware of the tens of millions, maybe 100 million people that Mao killed. As a direct result of his policies, not just people that just happen to die because China has a lot of people in it, and he ruled for a long time, but actually murdered or died from horrific economic policies.
Yeah, so do you have an understanding of what those terms, Leninist, Marxist, Trotskyist, or ite, and Maoist, what is the differentiating factor between these things? Do you know?
Well, my brief answer would just be that those were different philosophies, slightly different forms of authoritarian communism espoused by these different leaders, obviously, hence their names. But I don't know the exact differences, no. To me, communism is such a horrific ideology. This collective, the individual doesn't matter, so we can go ahead and murder them. That kind of individual, that is just such a horrific thing to me, because all we are is individuals, and we have self-ownership. So anyone that comes around and says, you don't matter, we can just murder you, we can actually, and this is actually what happened, is in some parts of China, like children, if they didn't like the principal or whatever, or the teacher, they would go to the school and pull the principal out, roast him like barbecue style, like on the front lawn, and then they'd all eat them, like cannibal style. I mean, string them up like, slabs of beef, and you could read the articles. They're horrific, and that's just a tiny little slab of what happened. I mean, it's such an insane ideology that I don't know if it's worth differentiating between them. I mean, maybe it's best if I become super educated about it, but at the same time, like we've talked about in the past, their answer is violence and statism. So what else do I need to know?
Yeah, certainly the means do not, like the ends don't justify the means. The means are horrible. And so, yeah, we were talking on the pre-call, like, do we need to actually be open to everyone's opinions? Like, is that, or is that just a nice thing to say? Because if you know that somebody is going to utilize violence to accomplish their ends, then their philosophy probably is not worth supporting. Like if their justification is that somebody is evil by their definition or by their skewed definition, and therefore violence is okay. Sort of like this whole punching Nazis thing is now a thing, and seems to be supported by many on the left.
Right. All you have to do is call a guy a racist,
And then it's
then
no holds barred.
any level of violence is just perfectly fine, and in fact celebrated. That this guy who went out and punched this guy just because he didn't agree with what he was saying, so he initiated violence against the guy just because he didn't like what he was saying, and now he's celebrated as some sort of hero.
Right, there's
disgusting.
songs about him. There's memes all over the internet about he's Captain America or Indiana Jones, and I'm sure it will incite even more people to commit aggressive acts of violence against people they disagree with.
Yeah, we've seen the left go from, actively, shouting down any kind of opposing viewpoint, and it seems to be that more and more they're getting more and more comfortable with just out and out violently attacking people that they disagree with. So I don't want to collectivize the people, but this person was obviously a leftist, and based on the current or the recent protests and violence at the inauguration rallies or inauguration protests, it sure seems they're getting more and more comfortable with not just shouting you down, but violently attacking you.
Yeah, I have this picture in my head of when we were left-leaning, that it was more of the hippie kumbaya style. Freedom of speech, nonviolent protest, like civil disobedience style. And now it's an aggressive, like, shouting down, you don't matter because you're this race or this gender, and yet somehow they consider gender not actually a thing. So it's totally contradictory.
Oh, yeah.
But now they're imposing violence upon people. And little do they know that that's the whole point of a state apparatus, is to impose violence on others to achieve a greater good, which is a very Maoist, Stalinist, Marxist, Leninist, communist thing.
Yeah, and it was just the one guy so far. I mean, there's been multiple instances of violence in these protests and whatever, but this one instance by this one guy is turning into a memes, and it's getting celebrated and propagated around. So it's obviously a bunch of people who have no issue with it, who in fact enjoy it. I mean, if they're making him out to be like some sort of a hero for violently attacking somebody whose views they don't agree with.
Right, and this is a bit unsubstantiated, but apparently after punching, I think the guy's name is Richard Spencer, and he's accused of being a Nazi or a white nationalist. And I'm sure he's not like the greatest guy in the world. But he was giving an interview, and then out of the blue, some guy like punches him in the side of the head and then runs away. Well, another person followed him on video, had a brief confrontation with him, pulled his mask down, and got a split-second view of his face. And then the internet went to work, identified the guy,
as it does.
doxed him, identified who he is. And I believe this with, a high level of certainty they got the right guy. But apparently he's a guy who lives in and around Washington, D.C. He is in his 60s. He is a guy who's into BDSM as a submissive. He hires women to berate him and put a dog collar on him and say terrible things to him, poop on him and make him eat the poop. So it's literally a shit-eating guy who committed this act of aggressive violence against somebody who, like I said, probably not the most savory person in the world, but he is now a folk hero. He has songs written about him. There are memes about him being Captain America or Indiana Jones punching Nazis and all the people on the left. And I say that, a little bit loosely, like not everyone, but a bunch of people on the left now are saying, hey, when is it okay to punch a Nazi? Anytime's taco time. Like, they're all about it. They're like, this is the greatest thing ever. Now, anyone we disagree with is fair game for aggressive assault.
Yeah, and it's super scary if this kind of trend continues. Because that's the line, right? I mean, you can disagree with someone as much as you want, but when you get things physical, you take it physical. That's where you turn into the thug and the bully, and just, I mean, it's one thing to whine about safe spaces and shout someone else down, which is kind of disgusting behavior for someone that supposedly enjoys free speech. But when you get physical, that's where I can no longer support you. So, hey, let's get back to this movie, unless you got a couple more things to say about that, Daniel.
No, we can move on with the movie. I'm sure things will come up.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so there's one more contradiction here. As they're going to the store, Ben, Viggo Mortensen's character, he pulls out all these homemade goods, like birdhouses and that sort of a thing, like handmade things out of wood that they've carved or whatever you built or constructed, that they're dropping off so that the owner of the store, can sell them, like on a consignment basis. And he had sold all the stuff previously, so they're getting another load. So he's an entrepreneur. This family, like, they're supporting themselves by selling these goods. So he's a capitalist, and yet, so not a capitalist. So there's just another contradiction there. From what he can tell, they weren't on like the dole or any kind of like government assistance. It's not like they were going to pick up their welfare check. They were going to sell the goods that they had made themselves.
Yeah, I wonder if this is one of those things where they're oppressed by the state of whatever the state of nature is, whatever the current situation is. Like they need.
Daniel, you're getting really quiet. I don't know what's going on, but you keep getting quieter and quieter.
All right, is this better?
Yeah, much better.
All right.
Can you repeat yourself what you just said?
Crank that shit up, motherfucker.
Step up to the mic. Don't be scared.
I'm not scared. So this situation where he's selling birdhouses in a capitalist entrepreneurial fashion, I wonder if in his mind the justification is the old trope of, well, nature's oppressing me, and because I live in an environment where money is a necessity, I need to somehow get money to, not be as oppressed by capitalism. Like capitalism is being enforced upon me, and I need money to pay my property taxes or to buy property or to buy certain provisions from a store, and therefore I need to be pragmatic and, participate begrudgingly. It should be just provided to me based on my need, right?
Right.
But because that system's not yet in place, I need to do something that's going to get me some money.
Yeah, there may be a little bit of that, maybe more so in the kids. I think the dad maybe is a little bit more of a realist, although, obviously with raising a bunch of socialist kids, it's hard to say that he didn't rub off on them a lot. We don't get that in the movie. It's not explicitly said. He doesn't make any kind of comment when he's selling his birdhouses. Because, the plot's got to move on. It can't all just be espousing one ideological phrase after the next.
Right. Well, I know we're going to get to this point soon, but I think based on what you've been saying so far that you're giving Viggo a fair amount of benefit of the doubt.
Well, yes, so he's a guy who has a certain view of the world, and based on what we see in the movie, he seems to be a dad who deeply cares about his children, wants to raise them the best he knows how. He doesn't want to just sit there and indoctrinate them. I mean, he's not like they're reading all kinds of different shit, right?
But it's his reading list. He's given them.
True, but it's not like Communism 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, and then done. They're reading all kinds of different things. And not only are they just reading them, but they are analyzing them and not just, regurgitating. That was a strong point made in the movie. So, and even at one point, we'll get to this later on, but at one point, when they're celebrating Noam Chomsky Day, and the middle son complains and says, why can't we, celebrate Christmas like the rest of us, like the rest of the world? And Viggo's like, well, what's your argument? Maybe if you present your argument in a clear fashion, and you'll convince us, and maybe we'll change our minds. So I don't see this guy as some sort of like totalitarian dictator guy. Is that what you see?
Well, that situation was actually kind of interesting to me because I think that in a way how he presented the opportunity to the child was rather confrontational. Like, okay, you don't agree, then give us your argument right now, right here, right now. And if you don't have it right now, then you're done. Like
he didn't start that though. He didn't start that conversation.
But it also
the son brought it up.
It wasn't like a. It was presented as an open dialogue, but I don't think it actually was. I think it was.
Wait a minute. If he had started making his argument about why they should celebrate Christmas, you don't think he would listen to it?
I don't think the kid was necessarily prepared to discuss it, and so he tried to force the kid to do it. Right.
He offered it. He offered the floor because the kid desired that. He took the floor. The kid took the floor.
Right, but
the father was like, "Okay, well, what's your argument?" Saying, I think that's a perfectly normal thing to do in any conversation. To say, if someone makes a claim that we should do a thing, to ask what their argument is for doing that thing.
All right, I'll put it this way: the kid was bluffing, and the dad called him on it.
Okay, so you think the dad was being disingenuous because he knew the kid was bluffing?
Well, that's how I read it initially, because I think he knew that the kid wasn't prepared to actually, support his argument. But I think given enough time, the kid could have had something more substantial to say. But I think by putting him on the spot, he wasn't ready. And maybe
possibly, but Dan, he was raising his kids the whole time. This whole movie has been about him raising these kids to be critical thinkers and to support their arguments and to analyze things.
Right, and out of the 6 kids, this was definitely the one who was always sort of the not going along with programs as much as the other ones.
Right, he is the odd man out. Right, and moving ahead, yeah, we will find he's the one that wants to stay and live with the grandparents and stuff. Yeah.
Right, but even when they're climbing the mountain, he runs into a situation where he's not listening to his dad and hurts himself, and his dad's like, "Well, who's going to help you?"
Right, and this. Okay, we can get into that. We're getting way ahead of ourselves, but
all right, I'll scale it back.
Okay, but this is the guy. Yeah, this is the kid that blames the dad for his mom's death. He's the one that is upset about his mom dying and thinks his father should have done more to help her. That is the main source of conflict between them. And
right, so
the complaint about Noam Chomsky Day and wanting to stay and live with the grandparents is all because of that.
Right, okay.
Okay.
So there's an underlying psychological difference, or a motivation to have conflict.
Yes.
He has
the father doesn't necessarily disagree with him.
Right. So he has a beef because he thinks his dad is responsible for his mother's death, and so he's going to exhibit that beef however he can.
Right. At most opportunities, he makes his displeasure known. He doesn't necessarily voice it always that it's about the mother, but he voices his displeasure. So I thought that was fairly realistic, in that you don't necessarily always say the exact things you mean to say, but you exhibit a certain level of emotional frustration and emotion, regardless of what you're actually saying. That's a very human thing. Okay. Let's get back to the movie because we're, at this rate, we're going to be like a 5-hour episode. At the store, remember, we were at the store, and the dad was selling these homemade goods. So the son goes in, and he gets mail from all these universities that it's applied to, and these are like Harvard, Yale, Brown, MIT, like super high-level stuff. And that's all, you've been accepted. Yeah, good for you. And then we'll get more into that later. Then the dad calls sister of the wife, finds out that his wife has killed herself because she is bipolar or manic depressive, and she has committed suicide. Then they all go home, and the next scene is he's like grieving under a waterfall, and then he goes in and he tells all his kids, and everybody acts as you would expect. Everybody's crying and really upset. And the middle boy picks up a knife and goes to stab his father because he feels that his father has betrayed the family and let everybody down by either allowing this to happen or helped it to happen or didn't do enough to prevent it. So the next scene is dad calling grandfather. Or let's see, I think it is the next scene, who tells him that not only is he not welcome at the funeral, but that he will have him arrested if he shows up at the funeral. Now, to me, I thought this was horrific. The fact that you would, regardless of how you feel about your family, your in-laws, the idea that you would involve the state thug enforcers to kidnap a guy because he wants to grieve for his wife at some sort of ceremony. What did you think about that scene, Daniel?
I definitely thought that was horrific. And I'll grant, he was the father and it was his only child and he wasn't super enamored with this Ben Vigo character.
Right.
But to deny the husband of the wife and the 6 children attendance of the funeral, and we haven't gotten to the fact that there was a will that had certain requests that were totally being ignored by the father.
Right.
So it was terrible, and to use the state as a bludgeon, as a weapon, I think is terrible as well, and I think that's all too common in situations,
Right. Yeah, you disagree with somebody, so you're going to call the cops.
Right, and what's that called? Like swatting? Like people will be like gaming against each other, and then they'll swat the other person, and I hardly want to.
You'll have a whole SWAT team outside your house, and then they'll break in and shove guns in everybody's faces, and just to find out that they're just playing a video game, and that somebody was watching you on Twitch, and they didn't like you for some or whatever reason. So they're gonna, it's horrific.
Yeah, and if it wasn't clear enough, I mean, Mao killed, anywhere between 60 to 100 million people, and that's not even half of the number of people killed by their own governments, not including warfare. So, the state is a killing machine. That's what it is. It's a violence machine. It's all about escalation and compliance.
That's right. Okay, so then the next scene is they're all sitting down to dinner, and they're upset that they're not being allowed to go to the funeral. So they're discussing that. The oldest son argues that the sense of entitlement from the grandparents is wrong, that they have any right to say what they can and cannot do. The youngest boy comes out and says that the rest of the grandparents' tribe are fascist capitalists. And then the boy goes on to define what a fascist capitalist is, because the daughter says, you don't even know what a fascist capitalist is. You're just repeating what Dad says. And so he says, fascist, violent nationalist, militant, supported by big business and their totalitarian single-party dictators. What do you think of that definition, Daniel?
Not bad. I think that it's a straw man argument against capitalism, which is what Marx was basically guilty of in his treatise in Das Kapital, where he would define capitalism in 2 different ways and attack the one that was actually incorrect, but in doing so made him sound more correct in his philosophy. And so exactly this, like saying that capitalism is in any way related to fascism or aggression or violence, when capitalism truly is the antithesis of that. Like, it is the absence of violence. It is voluntary interaction. It is
right. It is what spontaneously happens when you leave people alone. That's what it is.
Right. You choose to trade with me. I choose to trade with you. That's all capitalism is. And so, not every outcome is going to be great. Like, people are going to go into a trade thinking they will benefit, and whether they do or not is up to, whether they made a good decision. But the very nature of capitalism is not violent. And so that's how it is a confused perception and a straw man against capitalism in this movie and in many ideologies.
Right. Yeah, it seems like the left continuously gets wrong what capitalism actually is. I think it is a tool of oppression. And I don't understand. I mean, only if you believe that property is theft could you assume that capitalism is some sort of oppression, like you're oppressing me by not giving me your sandwich. It seems like just a ridiculous, childish argument to me, but I don't want to just ad hom them, but it really does seem that way to me. Okay, so the kids want to go to the funeral, but then the emotional question is, if they do go, would they lose their father? And they ask, if we go, would we lose you? And Viggo's like, maybe. They might arrest me. They might take me away from you. And then you would go into some sort of, either live with your grandparents or go into some sort of state, state like boarding house or whatever. So then there's that. Then the next scene is the mountain climbing scene, which you already talked about a little bit. The middle boy falls, and as they're climbing up on ropes and real mountain climbing, falls and hurts his arm. And Viggo basically says, there is no cavalry, no one will save you. The subtext is, you're responsible for yourself. What are you going to do? This is your training. This is how you survive. You are responsible for you. And for me, I really appreciated that message. It's kind of it kind of ignores other strategies in that making friends with people and having people come to help you isn't like a bad thing. It is a survival strategy. So saying that there is no cavalry, it's good to be self-sufficient and to be able to take care of yourself, absolutely. But being able to develop a network of support isn't necessarily a terrible thing. Just when you use violence to attain that support is where I draw an issue. When it's a voluntary support, I'm all for it.
Yeah, I agree. That scene was actually an example of actual anarchy. I mean, it was, there is no state apparatus in place. There's no 911 to come help you. There's no rescue team that's going to come in a helicopter. You got to figure it out. And I think that was also a contradiction in the father's philosophy, in that he's very supportive of Chomsky and communism and socialism, yet at the same time he's also this rugged individual. You need to be able to survive on your own.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a weird situation there where you would expect, you see so many, the people that are more, rugged individualist types are far more likely to be right-leaning. There are hippie communes around the world that do get together and kind of live together and live off the land sort of thing. But, and I got a little bit of a vibe off of that from the family. But I far more took them as a series. If this was a movie where you just saw that first scene and then they're training maybe a little bit and then just change it a little bit up to their preppers or survivalist, type people, I could totally buy that too. Instead, I wouldn't necessarily need to have them be hippies or whatever. You generally see that rugged individualism on the distrust of government side, the right-hand side. You tend to agree with that, Daniel?
Yeah, I do, and actually they exhibit that later in the film, a distrust of government and authority. So, again, more contradictions. And actually, Mao wrote a couple of philosophical works about contradictions, claiming that everything was a contradiction, which is counter to Ayn Rand's philosophy that contradictions cannot exist. And so that might be an interesting point to discuss on part 2 of Captain Fantastic.
Oh.
We need to wind this one down. I have been summoned, and we've been going just about an hour, so I think that's enough for this podcast. So not to cut this movie short, I think that we will be able to move on with part 2 of this in the next episode of the actual Anarchy podcast. So let's start winding this down. We probably got another minute or two that I will not be yelled at, and so we can close this one out.
All right. Well, we got about 20 minutes into the movie, 15 minutes into the movie, out of about a 2-hour movie. We got through page 1 of my notes, so good for us. But, yeah, there's so much more to discuss. it's really dense, really good stuff, and the ending kind of ruins the whole thing a little bit. We'll see. I do recommend, in the meantime, if you're listening to this and you haven't seen the movie, go out and check it out. And come back and join us for part 2 and maybe part 3. Who knows how much time we're going to have for part 2. We'll see. But it's a lot to get through, and it's going to take some time.
Indeed, sir. So this has been the Actual Anarchy podcast. This is the second of our podcasts under the new name. Previous name was the Read Rothbard podcast. If you wish to go back and view any or listen to any of our previous 40 episodes, feel free to do so. We would appreciate that. But even better than that is go to our website, actualanarchy.com or readrothbard.com. Click on any of the supporting Amazon links, readit4.me, Liberty Classroom, or Tip Jar pages. We have a Patreon, we've got YouTube, we've got all sorts of ways where you can consume our content or Murray Rothbard's content and support us. Give us even comments or challenges, like ask us a question. We'll answer it. I mean, we got lots of answers. But if we don't have one, we will definitely let you know. We'll say, oh, you know what? That's one of the things I don't know. I'll research it, or I'll say, it's probably best left up to the market, voluntary choices, all of that. Actually, that's my scapegoat. If I don't have an answer, I can say, well, I'm sure that the voluntary associations will solve that in some way. The free market will solve that in some way. So, spoiler alert, that'll be my answer if I don't actually have an answer. But I still think it's legitimate.
Well, it is legitimate because predicting the future is impossible. I was listening to, I think, a Part of the Problem episode where they were discussing, predicting the future. Like the question was, back in the day, if we get rid of slavery, how will we pick cotton? And if you had told them at the time, well, the answer is going to be this magical machine that is going to run on dead dinosaur juice, you would you look at them like they're a crazy person. But that's what we do. So just the idea that, there will be innovations that will come from other fields and just be unforeseen that will totally change the way we do things. And no one person could possibly predict any of that. And the market and people interacting voluntarily and being dynamic and innovative and being rewarded for their efforts by being able to not get stolen from and being rewarded for that is the best way to move forward with humanity.
Well said, Robert, and a good way to close this episode of the Actual Anarchy podcast. This has been Captain Fantastic Part 1. We will be right back at you in the next episode with Part 2, and who knows, if we don't get through that, maybe there's a Part 3. So do check out actualanarchy.com, which will right now redirect to readrothbard.com, where you can see books, lectures, articles, and this podcast, readrothbard.com. So thank you for joining us, folks, and we will see you on the next episode.
Bye. The Chipmunks. CHIPMUNK. We're the Chipmunks. Guaranteed to brighten your day. Do 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 do.